When I was in San Francisco, after I was programmed, I spent some time as a stagehand at a theater group's presentation, the performance. It was a group of artists who identified themselves as being living with disability and dealing with the attendant matters associated therein. Some had a cognitive disability, some had a physical disability. They were masterful and beautiful, and I was very proud to be able to work with them in the manner I did. I remember that one of the skits that they did, one of the segments, was talking about the history of eugenics, specifically around what was alleged to be mental illness. There were black and white photos that were projected on a screen behind a voiceover discussing a story while somebody made movement with their body in order to kind of personify their experience of grappling with the history of the alleged disability they experienced. It was harrowing, and it was also haunting. Everything from the history of lobotomies to the social programming, the refusal to allow people to reproduce, hiding them away so nobody could see them, allowing them to be tortured with electric shock therapy, allowing them to be broken down and even tormented physically, the concept of a sanitarium, how similar it was to allegations of experiments that were done in other countries. The fact that the same financiers of these facilities were also involved in financing industrial development in countries preparing for or engaged in acts of war with eugenicist aims. How this correlated with the gas and oil sector is not something I learned until later. I recently learned about something called the pipeline under the ocean, Pluto. It was in development around the same time that a Texas oil baron was sending his daughter to New York City in order to get mental health treatment because apparently she was disabled. She had a mental illness. Now, in some circles, she's a grande dame of Texas history, especially about charitable organizations attending to people with mental illness. I think it's a crock of shit. I think she was a spiritual woman, and her father and the men in that sector refused to control their impulses and thought that they would set up a paradigm based on the torment of the women in their family who just didn't want to be forced to produce constantly in an abstracted economy and have their connection with the land and the elements and the other things those men were doing with their binding spells. They didn't want to have to deal with the woman and her consciousness and her wisdom, so they disabled her and had her scientifically categorized and had a bunch of papers set up on her, especially in time for major war bond issues. Gave her some society treatments and maybe some other kinds of derivatives in the forms of cosmetics. And they've been doing this for going on 100 years now. They've been trying to export this model abroad, break down women, torture people that have command of their own consciousness, destroy an entire national and international paradigm to make you accept that your women are broken and need for you to have them controlled with medication and social programming and your economy to be abstracted so that they can get away with all kinds of dirty, toxic deals. Nobody's going to hold them accountable. And if they try, you got insurance. Here's the problem. Both major presidential candidates in the last week set up major hedges based on futures connected to murdered children. That's their leverage. At the end of the day, you know what mine is? Mental illness. Women and men, adult women and men, probably at or beyond their Saturn return, diagnosed with mental illness. The cows, the gentle, mature cow capable of giving you milk or maybe studying the gentle cow so that you can have other cows. in a pasture, just nice and serene, maybe singing a song or mooing nicely, our hooves hitting the ground, trampling the grass and the seed. We're not like those goats to dig it up by the root. We need some room to graze, we need some room to move. But we can use public parks, just like the Bureau of Land Management. That's my leverage. And if I had to accumulate a bunch of options to use in an effort of sacrifice, do I choose people that have been labeled mentally disabled and are adults, or do I let them murder children and say it's about a virus? I'm not choosing the children. Now, I contend that my alleged mental illness is not a mental illness. It was an act of political reprisal, twice. And it was used to illegally subject me to testing of directed energy weapons and other kinds of weaponized technologies, and goes back to when I was a child and has been covered up this whole time. And that a lot of people, adult people, allegedly declared mentally ill, have actually been bribed. That on one hand, it may preclude them from having certain kinds of social mobility, but when it is revealed, as it is being revealed, that the crimes that the United States specifically, but not exclusively, has committed are that extraordinary, and the complicity is that extreme, that if you're mentally ill, then by reason of mental defect, you can't be held criminally liable in the same way as somebody that was not declared to be mentally ill can and will be. That's what I mean by the bribe. And I don't accept the bribe. I never did. And I don't accept anyone who did. Many of the people that I know that were labeled as mentally ill, I believe, were actually experiencing a traumatic brain injury because they were being targeted by directed energy weapons that were aimed at trying to get them to accede to accepting that somebody else would get hold of their intangible property rights and other aspects of their inheritance and family legacy by having them declared mentally incompetent. Now, I wasn't deported to Florida, right? And I was never married, so it's a little different. State to state mental illness laws have a little different implication. But they saw fit to bring me to Texas in time to try to do it again and disappear the records and commit some of the most heinous crimes I've ever seen. Most of these women, they don't have a mental illness, but it's part of the society. And it's apparently what your husband or your daddy expected of you in order for you to get to enjoy the good life, if you have access to it. That's not going to be an option moving forward. There's starting to be some information I'm finding about people in other countries, specifically countries of the former Soviet Union, discussing how political opposition is subjected to detentions in mental health centers or alleged mental treatment centers, where they're subjected to up to 31 days of torment and allowed to be characterized as having a mental illness in order to discredit them. That's not a cow. You understand the difference? It's not acceptable to eugenically and socially engineer people because you think that there's a certain determinant of a socially or politically desirable genetic trait you want to market and or expropriate for yourself. There are people that have cognitive disabilities, this is true, but they're not mentally ill. And being targeted with electronic weapons and being subjected to biological warfare is not the same as accepting that you're sick and frail. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be an asshole if that is something you experience, and especially if the men in your life are so fucking cowardly that they actually expect you to perform that role. But we are way beyond making those excuses. You're their banks, ladies and gentlemen. You're their bank, and you need to be shut down. Now, if you're willing to expose and confront the actual institutions that are using you as their portal, then I will support you 100%. But you are not getting away with hiding behind children as human shields anymore.